Hello everyone, Leifrid here, and here we have Plato's Republic, the classic piece by the ancient Greeks and Plato. And so the Republic is about how Plato believes things should be run in the ideal state, and how the state should function, how society should function, and also about philosophical ideas around life, the soul, how the soul is immortal, and things like that. And the way it's written is actually through a series of conversations, as if we were in a courtroom almost, between Plato, Socrates, Glaucon, and a few other characters. And it's just their discussions between each other, and we're just kind of listening in as if it were kind of a podcast kind of thing. And so this has been one of the foundations of Western philosophy. So the book is divided into several sections and several chapters. And they kind of revolve around, like I said, everything from the state to other things. My one issue with this book is that I was just rereading a bit of it just now, and it is actually fairly difficult to follow or difficult to read. And it's not because of the content, it's the way it's written, which is unfortunate. It's not exactly super... I mean, it is literally like a transcript of a conversation. So there are kind of things where they're saying, do you understand what I mean? And the person says, oh no, can you rephrase it? For example, it'll be things like, we should class on the negative side with acts of rejection or repulsion. Of course. That being so, shall we say the appetites form one class, the most conspicuous being those we call thirst and hunger? Yes. Thirst being desire for drink, hunger for food? Yes. So even here, it's kind of hard to tell who is actually talking, because it says, oh, Glaucon spoke up, or and Anamedes spoke up, or whatever. And I'll be honest, like the first 2/3 of this book, I don't care for, because they're just talking about not random stuff, but they talk about the guardians, how to properly, raise a child. And they're kind of just going through a discussion when it could have been boiled down to just simple, almost bullet point observations. So there's just a lot of normal dialogue in here that is just difficult to get through, frankly. And a lot of the stuff is not very meaningful, actually. They cite Homer and, the Greek Iliad, and how, Agamemnon took, Briseis, and he took all this stuff away from Achilles, and that's bad. We shouldn't steal things from people. It's like, yeah, and they talk about trades and how trade should work. So a lot of the stuff I honestly don't care for. However, there's really, really, really good stuff kind of near the end of the book, actually. And so in the middle of here, you actually have the allegory of the cave, which is maybe the thing that Plato is most famous for and is so easily understood, which is that the allegory of the cave is, and of course the allegory in this book is the best part of it, because that's an actual story. But what the cave is that there are a bunch of men in a cave, and there is kind of a wall, and there's a fire, and then there are other men who have these kind of signs that are making shadows on the wall. And so these guys can't see the people making the shadows, they just see the moving shadows and the light. And it's kind of the implication that is their whole existence, and they are chained in this cave, and they're just watching, this basically ancient TV, basically these lights and shadows on the wall. And it talks about the one man who dares to break his chains and venture through the darkness of the cave, to go deeper into the darkness, And eventually he finds an exit, and he finds light, and he finds the real world. And his contention and his issue is that when he goes back to the other men to tell them, no, these images, these shadows on the wall and this light isn't real, that none of this is real. And you have to come out and exit, and you have to follow me into the darkness and come to the real world. And the issue and the contention is that none of them believe him. I guess it's a metaphor for how some people are able to become enlightened, some people are able to understand, and some people are just content to sit at home and watch the soccer game or the football game and munch on their popcorn, and they don't care. They do not care to go into the darkness to find the real light because they're content. And this is kind of Plato's difficulty, that there are individuals who have no desire to free themselves from the lies of society or whatever, and they're just content with a fake reality. And it's kind of, there's no solution to it. It's just like, that's the way things are. And you can only really truly awaken if you explore and look for and find the truth. So that's the allegory of the cave, very simply. And the other really interesting part of the book is how he defines the evolution, or the evolution of the declines of society. How one society will rise and fall due to a certain type of issue or disease, and the next society that it transforms into will also rise and then also fall due to another kind of social disease. And so there are 4 stages he defines. Okay, so this is what he says. There is no difficulty about that. There are the 4 types which have names in common use. First, there is the constitution of Crete and Sparta, which is so commonly admired. Second, and next in esteem, is the oligarchy, as it is called, a constitution fraught with many evils. Next follows its antagonist, democracy, then despotism, which is thought so glorious and goes beyond them all, as the 4th and final disease of society. He didn't actually mention here, but the first one is democracy. So the way he lays this out is basically you have the city-state of Sparta, in which a democracy, or time, I believe, is the Greek word for honor. So it's a society based on honor. And oligarchy is based on money and capital. Democracy is based on the people and popularity. And despotism is a singular individual. So in a democracy like Sparta, you have the people who basically they train men from an early age to fight and go out and do wars. And whoever is who kills the most or who wins the most, he is given the greatest honor. Like, Achilles in the Iliad. In a democracy, Achilles is the peak top guy. He is basically the ruler of the democracy, or, well, technically it'd be Agamemnon, but it would be someone like Achilles or Agamemnon, because they are the best at what they do, and they bring the spoils of war back to the society. Now, the reason a democracy fails is that eventually, if you're successful at doing this, if you're really successful at going to war and whatever, eventually you attain a lot of wealth and you attain a lot of spoils, and suddenly you have all this money that you have to determine how to share it, or who actually accrues the most money. And the downfall of the democracy is, hold on. Okay, so here we go. Here's what happens when a select, like half of the ruling families, basically amass most of the wealth. Once civil strife is born, the 2 parties begin to pull different ways. One breed of iron and brass towards money-making and the possession of houses, silver and gold, while the other one wanting no other wealth than the gold and silver and the composition of their souls. They try to draw them towards virtue and the ancient ways, but the violence of their contention ends in a compromise. They agree to distribute land and houses for private ownership. They enslave their own people who formerly lived as free men under their guardianship and gave them maintenance. And, holding them as serfs and menials, devote themselves to war and keeping these subjects under watch and ward. So basically, a success and a rising democracy will bring in wealth that will in turn corrupt the people who said, well, we fought and we won all these spoils, therefore we don't want to have to keep fighting, and they end up becoming greedy and, abandoning their honor to just the spoils of war and wanting to not have basically other people fight for them, basically. And so they consolidate their wealth, and of course that turns into a small group of moneyed people ruling society, which becomes an oligarchy, which is phase 2. He makes a distinction here that the plutocrat is a mere consumer of goods, is compared to the drone. And when he has squandered his money, he sinks into the dangerous class of paupers and criminals. So someone who just spends all their money until they're just done. In the oligarchic individual, the drone-like appetites have gained some ground against reason, but they are still held in check by the dominant passion for wealth, which calls for an outward respectability. So they're able to maintain their wealth and actually use it as a source of power. And so now you have an oligarchical society where everyone is kind of indentured and forced to work for the small ruling class that has amassed wealth and continues to amass wealth. And the way the story is told is it's told through like a generation of father and son. So from the democratic father comes the son who is greedy and doesn't want to work and wants to take his father's spoils and not want to, deal with honor or the ancient ways or whatnot. And so the downfall of the oligarchical society is when the discrepancy, obviously, of the wealthy and the poor gets so vast and so great that it becomes egregious. And like every revolution in history, there's a line in here that says, the poor but brawny, sunburnt man notices the overweight and foolishness of the rich oligarch for whom he serves and thinks the only reason this man has any power is because he is a coward. And that's the beginning of the revolution, in which the mass of people realize the bad deal they've been given, and they rise up and they destroy their wealthy masters, and the government is now ruled by the people, which is democracy. And so in a democracy, even in this interpretation of Plato's democracy, it was still a very old style type. So it was where not every single person has a vote. There are still serfs and slaves and the poor, and it's only you had to be a landowner, wealthy enough to be a landowner, and you had to be a man, and then you were allowed to vote, and then you were responsible essentially for all of your servants and your wife and your children under you to vote correctly on their behalf. And then you would have a series of representatives who would then vote for power and policies and whatnot. And he says here, first of all, they are free. Liberty and free speech are rife everywhere. Anyone is allowed to do what he likes, or so we are told. And he says, he says eventually what happens is, I always use the expression of the tablecloth. Eventually what happens is there are so many different distinct groups who are vying for power, and suddenly you have a bureaucracy which is born, which is responsible for processing all this power, that all the groups eventually start infighting or wanting more for themselves, so they start tearing at the tablecloth of society. That's just how I put it. But it's like they all want a piece of it, and eventually there's so much bureaucracy and so much corruption that eventually the entire system begins to break down. And with everyone screwing over everyone else and everyone lying about, you know, their virtue and their valor and how they're more oppressed than someone else, eventually that kind of situation devolves into chaos where no one can get along anymore. And then it takes a singular, distinct, and powerful ruler to step in, who essentially says, I will solve and bring order to all of this chaos. And so it's in this age, the metaphor of the family is also that, you know, the first age you had the father, who was an honorable man, the son who only wants wealth, and he grows old and fat, and then his son sees the injustice and rises up for the sake of liberty. And now this juncture from democracy to despotism or tyranny, the father has become basically weak and enfeebled as he has to give away and distribute the powers to separately equal factions who sometimes can't even take care of themselves, and the result is total chaos because no one can agree on anything. And so his son now sees the weakness, the chaos, and the disruption in society, and he rises up to say, you know what, I've had enough and I'm going to just take care of it. Yeah, this is great. He says that the parent falls into the habit of believing like the child, and the child like the parent. The father is afraid of his sons and show no fear or respect for their parents in order to assert their freedom. And so basically he says the despot rises, and the despot has absolute power. He essentially takes the side of the opposing party to the tyranny. There is an assassination attempt on him, or he claims there was. And once he uses this victimization foothold that everyone else is used to, he uses it as an excuse to seize power, amass a personal bodyguard, an army, and take over the entire state. And now it's under the control of a single individual. And this is where Plato kind of divides into the most ideal and the least ideal state. The least ideal state is a despot who does everything for himself and nothing for the country, while the most ideal state is actually a philosopher king. So again, kind of a singular ruler, but who is guided by good judgment and character and does everything for the state rather than for himself. And so basically what happens, well, people will rather side with the dictator because they are so fed up with the other people or the other kind of cries of victimhood or the other people who are vying for power that have no place being there, because in a democracy everyone is represented. And so they will side with a strong leader, sometimes just to spite the other side or the other sides. This is under when he taxes them so hard they think of only getting their daily bread. He will find a pretext for putting them at the enemy's mercy, and so making away with them. For all these reasons, a despot must constantly be provoking wars. So it's interesting. A despot has to constantly have a us versus them mentality in order to stay in check and in power. So the people have an enemy to fear and an enemy to fight, rather than realizing that they might be being screwed over themselves. And this whole thing really reminds me of the Russian Revolution, when the people rose up, took over power from the Tsar, and then instead they instituted a autocratic communist system where the despot was all, Lenin and Stalin were giving promises of peace, prosperity, returning the land to the people. And then in reality, they consolidated all power for themselves and executed and exiled a lot of their adversaries. And so Plato concludes by saying that it is perhaps inevitable that the despot and the story of the son will end in parricide, that it ends up with the son killing the father and seizing power for himself, and then society devolving into total anarchy. And it goes all around the corruption of power, the absolute corruption, etc., etc. And anyway, so he refers to his ideal state as a philosopher king, one who essentially rules and has a council of advising elders and philosophers, and they make the best decision for the society, which is pretty much what Plato and his friends are doing anyway. So, I mean, there it is. Self-interest? I don't know, but that's what he's going on about. And that's kind of the main aspect. The rest of the book, again, the 2/3 of the book is about, you know, what is the soul? What is justice? And I mean, it gets there and it doesn't get there. They conclude that it is good to do justice because it feels good to yourself. And the riches and the rewards of doing justice always outweigh the unjust, allegedly. The book also ends with the immortality of the soul, and they try to prove that the soul is immortal. And the way they do that is kind of like okay, where they say, let us first define good and evil as good is something that makes things grow and is healthy, and evil something that decays and is bad. And they make the argument that because a dying man is not wicked and not mean and bitter, and that he can be at peace, that there is something in him that is good and therefore grows long after he is gone. Therefore, the soul is immortal. That's how I read it, which is a really weird way to put it, but okay. They talk about how young people should be raised, and it's really funny because in here he quotes Homer. I want to find it. And he says, yeah, arithmetic, geometry, and dialectics should be introduced in childhood. You know, how to, raise your kids, what they should be taught. He says, basic things like, they have to be given self-governing so that their appetite for the pleasures of eating, drinking, and sex are regulated. It says, here again, we shall disapprove of much of what we find in Homer. And he's like, I agree. If it were not for my regard for Homer, I should not hesitate to call it downright impiety to make Achilles say to Apollo, thou hast wronged me, thou deadliest of gods. I would surely requite thee if I had but the power. And all those stories of Achilles dragging Hector round the tomb of Patroclus and slaughtering captives on the funeral pyre we shall condemn as false, and not let our guardians of the children believe that Achilles, who was the son of a goddess and of the wise Peleus, third in descent from Zeus, and the pupil of the sage Chiron, was so disordered that his heart was a prey to two contrary maladies, mean covetedness and arrogant contempt of the gods and men. You are right. So it's so funny that they take one of their, most ancient epics and we're like, this is actually not that good of a story to teach to kids. It's funny because when he talks about, if only I had the power to destroy you. I don't know why I keep thinking of this, but I think of that scene in Conan the Barbarian where he prays to, I don't remember the god's name, but Grognak or whatever the god's name is. And he's like, I pray for success in battle, and if you don't give it to me, to hell with you. But yeah. Anyways, that's the Republic. Surprisingly, there's a lot of it I just do not care for. Difficult to read. Maybe I'm just a big dummy and I can't understand it, but it just feels very convoluted the way it's written about what is good, what is justice. Justice is the good thing, and therefore, you should do it. I guess. But yeah. It's still a great read. The cave story, the descent from, or the shift from democracy to despotism and what is a philosopher king, really cool. And yeah, it's one of the cornerstones of Greek philosophy. So there it is, the Republic. And anyway, as always, guys, keep reading.